Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Catholicism. Today, I'm here with my good friends Pat Flynn and Daniel Vecchio. Both of them have been on the show before. But maybe before we just get started into our topic today on the logical problem of evil, maybe Pat, can you just tell us a little bit about what you're up to? And then Dan, if you can do so as well.
Yeah, up to a lot. Currently, at least of most probably interest to your audience, finishing my PhD with a focus on the doctrine of divine simplicity. And what I'm claiming there is that it is a very good theory insofar as it solves a lot of problems in a lot of areas in a very elegant way. So once that is finished up, I'll probably, we could have a chat about it or something. Working on a number of papers, some of which actually with Daniel, in addition to this recently published one. So
Hmm.
I guess our mission recently, Daniel, was to sort of like put classical theism on offense, right? That's kind of so we got a number of papers where we're showing no, because classical theists are always on defense, right? Now this is why modal collapse doesn't work, or these other coherence objections, and I think that they've done a good job of that. But I've always been interested in like the sorts of questions that it seems like only classical theism can answer that a lot
Hmm.
of people have seemed to forgot, have, yeah, lost track of. Uh, Running my Substack, the humbly named Journal of Absolute Truth, and my podcast, Philosophy for the People, if people want to check any of that out.
And I'm still teaching over at a local community college here in Southern California, and we're wrapping up our semester at this time. So got a couple of weeks left, and I'm already collecting all final papers and all sorts of issues coming up. So been busy with that. Been working with uh, Pat on defending classical theism and also just working with some colleagues on some interesting stuff around pilgrimage, which I'm hoping will come out at some point. So I'm starting to dive deep into some of the philosophical implications of pilgrimage, and so we'll see how where that goes. But I'll let you know as it develops. But yeah, I'm working with a
Also,
good friend of mine at the college on that. So
Daniel, I realize that this is the first time I think I've ever called you Dan, shorthand. Do you mind if I call you Dan?
that's fine. I absolutely.
I usually try not to shorthand people's names unless they're okay with it. Um, anyway, so we're looking at this paper that you wrote for New Blackfriars. It's published, people can access it, called There Can Be No Successful Logical Argument from Evil. And I just want to set the groundwork to understand what's going on in the paper. So I think there are like two topics to keep in mind. One is first, what is specifically the logical problem of evil? And then second, um, uh, why should we understand that the problem of evil is an internal critique? Why is that relevant? Why is that important? Why do some people go wrong when they try to, critique atheists on different grounds? So maybe let me start with Pat, and then Daniel, if you want to add anything, we'll just do that.
Sure.
Yeah, let's see if we can give a very condensed history and overview of the problem of evil. So, as the name implies, there's a problem, and it's evil. And, well, who's that a problem for? I guess it's a problem for people that believe that God exists. And why? Because evil, broadly understood, is just like any negative state of affairs, right? So traditionally, evil wasn't just moral evil, but it could be natural
Mm.
evils, any bad stuff generally. Not to like downplay it, because there's often horrendous evils, but just bad stuff in general, right? And the thought is, well, this seems to be in tension with the idea that the foundation of reality is utterly perfect and totally good and omnipotent and omniscient, right? So you find very classic formulations that if God is all powerful and all good, then he would want to prevent all the evil in the world because he's all good, and he would be able to do so because he's all powerful. So why is there evil in the world, right? And then, yeah, through just various formulations of that in our contemporary age, the logical problem of evil is one that really tries to show that there's a very strong tension, the strongest type of tension, a literal
Mm.
contradiction, right, between negative states of affairs and the posit of this sort of omni-attributed being, God, right? They're like that evil is disproof of God, right? And we'll get into specific formulations as we go, but it's a very strong form of argument, hence the logical argument from evil. But what sort of happened, or at least the story that a lot of people hear, is that that argument was going along, fairly well. Of course, there were defenses and takedowns, but it seemed like it had a lot of steam behind it until a certain philosopher named like Alvin Plantinga came along and wrote on the topic and apparently like really beat it up. And to the point that even certain prominent atheists were like, yeah, I actually don't think this argument is successful. Maybe Plantinga's like response isn't totally satisfying, his broad free will defense, but it's hard to run the argument through, in light of his considerations. What was that
Yeah,
book called?
Pat,
God, Free and Medieval or something like that. Yeah, forget the
if
title.
I could interject, yeah, I
Mm-hmm.
think it's Mackey who actually said, I have a quote from him
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
that's relevant. He said, since the defense is formally, that is logically possible, this is in response to Plantinga's defense,
Mm-hmm.
and its principle involves no real abandonment of our ordinary view of the opposition between good and evil, we can concede that the problem of evil does not, after all, show that the central doctrines of theism are logically inconsistent with one another.
Mm-hmm.
And then he goes on to say, but whether this offers a real solution of the problem is another
Right.
question. So he essentially concedes, because the way Mackey sets it up, right? He says, okay, God is all powerful. Um, on this sort of definition of what God traditionally is, God is morally perfect in some sense, that is God would is related, or God's goodness is related to evil, such that God would seek to eliminate it as far as possible. And since those two sort of propositions seem to entail the complete elimination of evil, God's ability and desire to eliminate evil is sort of infinite, then we would expect there not to be any evil. So at the end of the day, he concedes that Plantinga was able to sort of imagine a possible way to reconcile all of that without abandoning any of the key
Right.
assumptions to Mackey's formulation of the argument. But that doesn't mean that the argument is dead as a doornail, as Dickens might put it. So maybe, Pat, you want to
Yeah, no, that's
continue
super
that?
helpful. And I remember me and Daniel, as we were writing this paper, like, well, we've heard this story that,
Yeah.
everyone concedes that it's dead, and we try to look into it, and yeah, there's general truth to it. But for the purposes of our paper, it's not totally true. Like the logical argument from evil is still around, right? People are still trying to push this through. So like we're not beating a totally dead horse, right? There's this sort of yeah, some real recent stuff in the literature of thinkers who think that they can push this argument through.
Hmm.
But on the other hand, yeah, a lot of the conversation has shifted to other formulations of arguments from evil, evidential and abductive arguments from evil, and these are a bit more modest in a sense, insofar as they'll say, okay, maybe there isn't like a straight disproof here, but evil is really evidentially heavy against theism, or the best explanation for the various types of suffering in the world and the distribution of suffering is clearly a naturalistic hypothesis, stuff like that, and I've written on that too. I've got published work on those versions actually coming out in a volume this summer that focuses on some of Paul Draper's work. But that's a separate argument. In our paper, we really just wanted to consider the logical argument from evil. And in a nutshell, what we're saying is that when you understand what's needed to construct a logical argument from evil, one of the key things that you need, and we'll get into this more in a minute, is a moral linking principle, something that is meant to sort of connect, God and negative states and affairs in such a way that we could actually attribute failure or defect to God.
Mm.
And that's a problem because if a perfect being is also a failure, we seem to get a contradictory type of result. And what we're aiming to show is that there's no principle available that either doesn't break down from an inductive case when you try to apply it in a certain way, which we'll talk about in a minute, or isn't just flagrantly question begging.
Mm.
And this is a sort of interesting approach because what we're ultimately showing is that such a principle, if there is one, that would help us formulate a successful logical argument from evil, is epistemically inaccessible. That's ultimately what we're showing, right? There's no way that you could know that it's true because it's such that the only person who'd be in a position to know whether it's true
Mm.
is actually God, right? So what does that show? It shows that there can be, at least from our epistemic position, no successful logical argument from evil. So this is kind of different, isn't it, Daniel, in the
Mm.
sense that like a lot of what's done against problems of evil are either theodicies or defenses. And a defense is just showing like here's a broadly possible scenario to show that these things, like what Planiga does. He doesn't even think that like he doesn't. You don't have to endorse a defense, right? Like maybe you don't even think it's true. You're just showing like I'm just showing you there's actual no inconsistency here, right?
Right.
For all we know, it could be true. That's a defense. Whereas a theodicy is something a bit more, I think, manly and full throated. And this is I offer one of these in my Sophia book. I actually do think that there are good theodicies, and that's where you're actually showing no. Here is the actual story, right?
Mm.
Here's why God allows a world like this to occur. So a theodicy is a bit more bold. I think Christians have a lot of resources there, but we're doing kind of neither of those things, Daniel. So I actually didn't even think about this until now because of exactly how we would classify what we're up to. Maybe Daniel has some thoughts there.
Well, I think, excuse me, I have a frog in my throat. It's an instance of evil. But uh, one thing that is important in understanding the setup of our response to the problem of evil, which we're trying to categorize as a kind of um, epistemic issue. We're trying to show where the burden lies, I think, and that burden can't be discharged. So we're not trying to respond to it. We're cutting it off at the pass and saying, hey, wait a minute. Exactly how are you justifying your linking principles? And so to understand that, I think it's important to specify that the logical problem of evil as it's traditionally presented is an internal critique of theism. And so what is an internal critique? In other words, what we're saying is this isn't the claim that you look around the world, you see evil, and you think, yeah, there probably isn't a God. It's more the commitments of the theist, which traditionally includes a belief in evil, a belief in a perfect being, and that somehow evil and this perfect being are opposed to one another is a problem. And so then theodicies traditionally try to reconcile the apparent paradox or contradiction by offering some resource within theism that might account for that paradox. What we're doing, though, is we're saying once you sort of really get down to what the principle is that links God's attributes to this idea of what God would do or what God's obligated to do in creating the world, that it's just unsustainable.
Mhm.
There's no way that the atheologian, as you might put it, is going to um, convince anyone that that's true without flatly assuming the very thing that's at question. So I'll sort of pass that back to Pat if he wants to.
Yeah, I think the idea of an internal critique is worth spending a little bit more time on. So the idea is the way we illustrate this in the paper is we kind of critique a kind of poppy level apologetic move, right? Where a theist will be like, you raised the problem of evil, atheist, but you've refuted yourself because without God, you couldn't even have the metaphysical resources to declare something evil. So I win, right? And that misses, I think, the real point and force of arguments from evil, precisely because they're issued as an internal critique. Like it doesn't matter what the atheist believes; they could be a moral nihilist. What they're saying is that no, it's in your soup of commitments that you have a contradiction. This is a problem for you. My beliefs are totally irrelevant, right? So it's not like even if it were true, which is controversial, that like all forms of moral realism require some sort of theistic, framework or metaphysic. That's irrelevant to the problem at hand. We also point out that it works both ways, though, that if you're going to issue an internal critique against the theist, then you do have to play with their commitments, right? You can't import, say, like a certain axiology, which is a value system that the theist would reject and run like hedonic utilitarianism or something like that. Like if that generates a problem, the theist is gonna be like, well, I don't subscribe to that, so this isn't a problem for me, right? So it's both like, something that makes the problem a little bit more serious for theists, but also it makes sure that everybody plays fair, right? It is as an internal critique, it's something that the theist has to realize, okay, this is something that is going on within my worldview, but at the same time, I'm only obligated to make the connections with the stuff that is in my worldview. Now, granted, some things are shared in common. Like I think like the certain just obvious data, like the fact that there is evil and suffering, that goes across worldviews, right? I mean, like, I guess if you've got like some odd theory where you don't think there is any evil or suffering, then maybe this isn't but you've got other problems at that point, right? Um, but, various, higher level interpretations or philosophical positions that aren't shared, we have to be clear on, well, what does the theist actually contain among their commitments? And can we sort of put that stuff together, or can we not? So that's the project. I hope, is that clear, Swan? Is that helpful?
Yeah, it's very good. So I think now we can move into just the argument itself that you present in the paper. And I would say to the audience, like there's a lot of good things that you do in the paper. Like you go through the literature a little bit, you like set it up very well. And so we're cutting through a lot of things, and we're probably not going to get into every potential question and objection that even you and Daniel responded to in the paper. So I just want to get to the heart of the argument that you present. And let me give my best shot at it, okay? And I'm
Yeah.
probably going to miss certain things. It might be a little imprecise, but this is why, I'm talking to the living voices of the paper.
It
So,
could be
It's
better, Swan.
it's well,
Yeah.
no,
We
I
might be like,
trust
oh
me.
man, you got it
you
better than we
got.
did. Okay.
Well, as I was like, telling Daniel and you beforehand, like it's been a while since I read this paper, right? So I might not even remember. So please, yes, refresh my memory, Swan. What is our argument?
So I think like the line that stood out to me in your paper was that the logical problem of evil is unresurrectable, or there's just no way to salvage it. And I think that's a great way to kind of frame what's going on. So you bring up the example of J.R.R. Tolkien and the world that he creates in his head, and how, there are instances of evil within that imaginary world, right? And we can establish that there's this causal dependence between the imagined world or the world that he creates and his mind, his intellect. But you can't, beyond that, it's really hard to say anything else about that relationship. So, for example, the fact that there are orcs and evil people and evil things that happen in Middle Earth, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that then, you can infer that he's an orc or that he is somehow just as
Evil.
evil and depraved as some of the characters that he has in the book. And so I think a lot of people would find that intuitive, right? That it's really difficult and challenging to make that kind of leap. But then it seems as if, like with the logical problem of evil, you have to make that kind of leap. Oh, there are evil people in the world. There's instances of suffering. Oh, and so God must be, you say he's morally perfect, but then he must be morally deficient. And so ergo contradiction. And what you try to show is, okay, um, however the person, the defender of the problem of evil tries to fix and get around this scenario, by, as you say, bringing up some linking principles, they either, I guess, lose, let's say, the plausibility, or they lose a plausible linking principle, or it becomes question begging where they say, oh, well, the difference is that God, I don't know, like the reason why the Tolkien example breaks down is because you only have obligations to real people and real characters, so to speak.
Mhm.
And so that's why we can make more inferences than we could in the Tolkien case. But as soon as you do that, you're just actually repeating in different words
The
the
conclusion.
logical problem of evil, right? The conclusion.
The conclusion of it, yeah.
And so it's like no matter where you go, it's just I mean, yeah, it's just you can't fix it,
Mhm.
basically. You can't really prove what you want to prove, which is what the logical problem of evil is demanding. We're not talking if it was the evidential problem of evil, maybe it'd be a little different. But the main point that you get across is you can't prove it. You can't even know if you've proven it.
Well, it's really good, Swan. You clearly read the paper and probably have retained more of the details than I have at this point. But let's see if me and Daniel can fill a few things in. As to try and like cover my own butt. I always like to remind people that like when philosophers write a paper, by the time like the paper, if it's published, ever sees the light of day, a lot of time has typically passed. Mine is often on different things, so it's like, yeah, it's like music, right? Sometimes like I'll run into people from high school because I play guitar in high school. But like, can you still play that like one song? I'm like, dude, I haven't played that since high school, man. I can play other songs, right? I could give you other philosophical arguments. All right, but with that said, all right, yeah. So what are we up to? Well, you brought up the notion of deep metaphysical dependence or grounding, and this is going to be an important concept in our argument. So, something is sort of deeply grounded or metaphysically dependent when all of its being and properties are sort of immediately synchronically being caused by its ground, right? So in the literature, this is often called metaphysical dependence or metaphysical causation or deep dependence or grounding, right? And what we show is this is a really important concept. One, because it's actually how God and the world relate. It's for class. This is one of those internal commitments of classical theism. This is a deep grounding relationship between God and the world. That everything God creates, every being and all their properties are immediately being grounded, caused by God. Right. So there's this deep synchronic dependence relation. Okay. And what you said in very simple and accessible terms is that when you have this sort of relation, the types of inferences that you can make across layers of reality, right, between the ground and what is grounded, are actually very limited. And we develop a rule of restricted inferences. Okay, but you gave some good examples. So, for example, an imagining mind and what is imagined is an instance of grounding, right? Where if the imagining mind stops imagining, then everything that's being imagined is poof, it's gone. Or a dreamer and what's dreamed. There's other examples that aren't as relevant, like a waltz and the movement of the dancers, but we focus on the imagining mind and what's imagined because I think it's the best example for our purposes, right?
Yeah, Pat, let me just say as sort of setup for this, and I'll let you continue, that in thinking about this grounding principle, what we ultimately have in view is this linking principle between God and evil. So what we're saying is that in the most broad sense, the atheologian has to run a linking principle that is related to grounding. And so when they do that, they're going to have to make some sort of claim about what we can infer. So that gets back to the internal critique, and this is going to link the two principles. And now we're looking at it, and we're looking at case examples, right? We're looking at, okay, here's an example of the author and his imagined world. Try to think of some other examples, and what can we exactly infer? So just go.
Yeah,
I'll
that's
pass it back
great.
to
And
you.
what we're going to say is that that these moral linking principles violate this rule of restricted inferences, which I guess I should probably
Do you
mention
want me to
what
just
that
read
is real
it
quick.
or
Yeah,
because
if you
I
have it
can
up, that will save me
yeah.
some time and probably be a bit more precise. So this is the
Yeah.
idea of what sorts of things can we infer in these grounding relations, because this is going to play, I think, a pretty critical role in the argument.
If A and B are realities such that A is less fundamental than B, and where A is metaphysically caused by B, then we can infer properties of B from A only under specific conditions. And those two conditions are one, it is logically impossible for A to have some feature F if B does not have F. And then two, inductive evidence supports that feature F in A implies F in B based on other known instances of metaphysical dependence. So, I mean, yeah, how do you want to break that down?
Yeah, so examples help, right? So
Yeah.
like let's think of Tolkien imagining his story, right? Well, what can we infer? Well, from the imagined story, we can at least infer the existence of the ground, right? Because it would
Yeah.
be impossible for what is grounded to be there unless the grounded actually exists. Okay, so that goes through. But then, as you already illustrated, not a whole lot else, right? Like, say the story has the feature of orcness in it because there's orcs. Can we infer that the ground is an orc? No, right? Say that the story has the feature of depravity in it, deprivation, privation, moral failure. Can we infer any of that of the ground? Clearly not, right? So this is why we call it the rule of restricted inferences. The inferences are very restricted. They're very few that we can legitimately make. So either if it has to be logically impossible, right, for the the grounded to have some feature if what does the grounding doesn't have it, or we can build like an inductive case where it's like, okay, in this case we see that the feature is in the ground from the grounded, and we have a bunch of other cases to support it. But the problem is when you have the moral linking principles, we see that the inductive case works against it, right? So this will help with some examples too. So let me grab one of the moral principles that we test initially in the article. You might have it up before me, Swan. Here it is. All right. So here's a mooring principle. This will put some meat on the bones, right? So and people will find this very plausible, and I hope they do, because I think it is a plausible moral principle. Namely, if one is in a position to prevent the suffering or sin of some other being without incurring some cost clearly worse, they should do so. Otherwise, they are morally at fault. And I think when we're talking about beings related on the same level of reality, like human beings, this principle is clearly true, right? If I can prevent the suffering of some like little child who's drowning in my neighbor's pool without any cost to me, I'm right there. I should absolutely do so, or am morally at fault. The problem is when you try to put this principle up vertically and get it to go across layers of reality, it clearly breaks down in all the inductive cases that we have. So the Tolkien, and we don't have that many, right? Right? We have like the Tolkien and the story that he imagines, and the dreamer, and whatever he dreams. But clearly it doesn't work there, right? Because we don't infer that Tolkien is morally at fault, even though he easily could have prevented the suffering and sin of his characters. And I know the immediate outcries are like, well, they're fictional or imaginary, but that we're winding up to that point here very shortly. We definitely have that in mind. So, all right, Daniel,
Right.
yeah, your thoughts.
Yeah, no, just to put a pin in something that some of our astute listeners will probably already perceive is, well, you're going to have a problem if you're going to try to infer any positive moral attributes of the deity from the world. Like if we can't say that orcs mean that Tolkien's a bad guy, then likewise Aragorn's valor is not a reason to think that Tolkien has any valor. And so how do we get to some sort of morally perfect God or a belief in God's goodness, right? And so I just putting a pin in that comment, something maybe we can address a little bit later once we explain how the argument as it moves along, as the atheologian tries to tighten the vice around us, is actually working against himself. So, yeah, just go back to you, Pat. Do you want to kind of
Yeah,
explain
sure. You
that,
want
or
me to keep
yeah,
this train rolling? All right. So
yeah,
what are they going to do now? So I think if you realize that sort of principle, yeah, that isn't going to work. It's great horizontally, but as soon as you try to stand it up, which you have to get across these layers of reality, it fails, right? It breaks down. It's not a linking principle in that case, all right? So now we have to try and shape the principle up and try and get it to run vertically. So you might try and we offer the following modification in our paper, and you might just try to qualify it as follows. You might say, if some being, which is the metaphysical cause of some other being, is in a position to prevent the suffering or sin of that other being without incurring some cost clearly worse, they should do so. Otherwise, they are morally at fault. So they just kind of insert the idea that if it's the metaphysical cause. But again, that fails right away because we have the Tolkien example. Who's the deep metaphysical cause? And once again, we cannot infer with any sort of confidence that Tolkien is morally a failure or suffers from some sort of deprivation or what have you, just based on the various aspects of his imagined scenario. Okay.
Right. And let me just interject as well that the horizontal principle, which is, I think, the intuition pump that the atheologian is using, we actually concede, right? So if I'm walking by a duck pond and I see a 5-year-old struggling to stay afloat and they're drowning, do I have some sort of moral obligation to assist? I think most of us have the intuition, yes, especially if it's at little cost. Say I'm an Olympian swimmer and I've got swim trunks on, right? You know, I won't even damage my nice suit. What's holding me back? You know, there we would say, yeah, there's something wrong with a person that's not willing to do the minimum to help another. And so the first iteration of our principle is horizontal, and we just say it doesn't apply because that's not to be too pejorative here, that's kind of a theistic personalist conception of God, where God is one of the denizens of our reality who happens to not be helping out,
And
right?
not only that, Daniel, but it will end up equivocating on the term cause if they
Right.
right, which is this is where like the internal resources of the classical theists are really actually very helpful, right? Because of our sort of pluralistic understanding of ontology and causality in
And
general, right? Yeah.
and if I can just add, like, I think because the most common like way of framing the problem of evil is that like God's like a father and we're his children, and anybody would agree that like with some of the evils that go on in the world, if a father could stop that and he doesn't, then there's something wrong with him. So, but
Right.
yeah,
What is it that the gospel says? You know, what father would give a scorpion
right,
to
yeah,
something?
yeah, yeah. That's right. When he
If I
asked
were
for
more
a fish.
Protestant, I'd have it. But
Yeah, or like was it if he the remnants of Protestantism within me, what is it? Like if he asked for a piece of bread, who would give him a stone, right?
right,
Anyway, that's a conversation for another time. But
Now that you
right.
only listen to the Pope, right? Yeah.
that's right.
All right.
But yeah, so but I mean you're pointing out that like the causal dependence and relationship between us and God or yeah, us and God is markedly different, radically so, in fact, from like the relationship of a father and a child, even if there might be some analogy, but it's an analogy
Yeah, and ultimately
nonetheless.
we're going to say God is, analogically, a
Right.
father is class. And another distinction here, we're just looking at classical theism. We're not looking at Christian theism. I actually think if you're a Christian theist, yeah, you got a little bit more work to do. But that's fine. We can do that work later on. We're just taking one step at a time, right? So no problems there, I don't think.
So just to
Um,
recap,
yeah.
we kind of neutralized the horizontal variant. Uh, Pat propped it up vertically and showed that with Tolkien. Uh, Still not showing it. You're still not showing the issue here. What is it? And I think theists need to be comfortable when talking to atheologians or atheists about the problem of evil, to not rush to help them make their case. Make your case. What is this principle? Because that's where I'm saying uh, the horizontal examples is a huge intuition pump that is utilized to get the argument to run. But as soon as you start taking it out of our common everyday experience and say, well, no, we're really talking about this deep metaphysical dependency. Now, can you justify it under that reorientation? It's not so clear.
Yeah.
And
So
go ahead.
no, you finish your thought, Daniel, and then I'll
No, that's
hop
all right.
in. Yeah.
I'm done.
Yeah, so the final sort of qualification or amendment to the principle we consider in the article, I think, is the obvious one, right? Where they're going to restrict it to real rather than imaginary or fictional beings. And we're going to see this has a particularly not great result for proponents of the logical problem of evil, insofar as it winds up generating a principle that's really just a disguised statement of the conclusion, which is just question begging. So let's say that they amend the principle as follows, right? If some being, which is the metaphysical cause of some other real being, not fictional or imaginary, is in a position to prevent the suffering or sin of that other real being without incurring some cost clearly worse, they should do so. Otherwise, they are morally at fault. All right, so just, I mean, like one sort of preliminary note, and we note this in the paper, is that if you shut off, all of the fictional or imaginary examples with the cases of deep metaphysical dependence, right? Then you're just closing off really all the possible inductive evidence that could support their case, but actually doesn't, right? So now they need to show that it's logically impossible for a less fundamental reality to have some relevant feature such as defectiveness if the more fundamental reality does not. But the problem is this restriction winds up rendering the principle flagrantly question begging. And the reason is this: it's because there's only one possible instance of this restricted principle in the situation of God and the world, since only God, again, internal to classical theism, can create real beings like us. There's nothing else that can do that. So once you understand this, again, this relates to the playing fair with an internal critique, right? The restricted principle just is literally the same thing as saying, if God or the being that grounds reality, real beings, has the capacity to prevent some aspect of reality from coming to be and prevent their suffering or sin and so on and so forth, right? That's not a linking principle. That's what you're hoping to establish. That's the conclusion, right? So you're just begging the question at this point. Right. So if you rewind the tape, what I think our paper, what our argument ultimately shows, is that all the inductive cases we have show that these very plausible moral principles that certainly I think do apply along the horizontal dimension clearly fail when trying to go across layers of reality, which you must do to get a problem of evil to run. And by the time you so restrict the principle to make it a serious contender, it merely becomes a disguised restatement of the conclusion, because there's no other substitution instances, which means
essentially the linking principle is sui generis. It's one of a kind. We're talking about the type of causal dependence of creation, right? Because you're saying the causal dependence where a reality is generated. And there just is no other example, because that's just the doctrine of creation. And so if you're saying, well, when you're a creator, you have logically speaking, you have some sort of obligation to eliminate evil. Well, whatever justification you're going to give for that principle, that becomes the real argument. You see? And so it's in that sense it begs the question. So how do you justify that principle? Well, whatever narrative the atheologian wants to give for that, that's really going to be the argument then. And so what is that argument? What's that justification other than, again, assuming it's true? And again, don't shoulder the burden of proof based on intuition pumps around bad analogies. And that's sort of what we're doing. There was something else I wanted to say about that, but it escaped me. So I'll just
it'll pop back into your head, I'm sure, in a minute. So ultimately, what is that proving? Well, I think it just shows that, again, that the principle that you would need to run this sort of argument is it's epistemically inaccessible. Like, how could you know that that's true? And we kind of like teasingly say, well, seems like you would have to know it from experience, but that would be really impossible unless God revealed it. Because the only experience relevant to that principle is the one of God creating real beings, right? He's the only one who would know if that principle is true. And I say we're teasing about that because if God revealed that principle was true, it would show he's morally defective and you can't trust him, right? So you still wouldn't know. You still wouldn't know that it's true, right?
I remembered my point.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just real quick. Was just to help the audience along to sort of understand the kind of mode of argumentation we're undergoing here. It's analogous to what one might find in the debate between, say, someone who's pro-choice and pro-life, right? And the question there, the central premise is it permissible, say, to end the life of a fetus? And then you start saying, well, what is it? What is a fetus? And then you start getting these little ad hoc adjustments, right, to what this thing is that we're terminating in order to say it's morally permissible to do so. So you say, well, it's not born yet. So, or something like that. You make these sorts of adjustments so that you don't capture what the permissibility of killing infants, but you do prior, right? So you want to make this sort of delineation that applies in the right case. And what often happens by the end of that discussion is the pro-choice proponent has made so many ad hoc adjustments so that they can fit exactly what they want to be able to terminate, that you ask the question, like, haven't you just kind of begged the question then? You've assumed at the outset what you want to be able to terminate, and now you're making these adjustments so that it fits exactly what you're allowing to terminate. And that begs the question. In a similar way, we're saying, okay, well, God should eliminate evil. Well, why? Well, because of the sort of causal power he has an obligation to eliminate evil. Okay, well, why? And then we start kind of narrowing in on exactly what that causal principle is. And it turns out that through these ad hoc adjustments, it just comes out to being the very conclusion they seek to infer.
Yeah, Daniel,
Anyways,
that's a great analogy. And I wanted to ask you, since you wanted us to put a pin in this, but I think we can get to it now. You mentioned before, I think what you call in the paper the problem of like moral collapse. That might be a bit distinct from what you were talking about, but basically, if you can't, the atheist rejoinder might be, if you can't attribute any fault to God, neither can you attribute any credit to him, any good positive attributes. If we run with your argument, I don't know if you want to take that on really quick. And I know, I guess moral collapse is a different question, but just on this
no,
one, yeah.
I think
They're related.
you're
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
are related. And in fact, that's sort of what we had in mind in writing that section. And here we want to go back to the well of classical theism. And in a sense, we're willing to concede, yeah, looking out at a sunset might not be a sufficient reason to say God is good, although it might evoke that emotionally, right? Oh, look at the sunset, because you're also ignoring maybe in the other scene that a building's collapsing or something. So it's
Mm.
kind of like a wash. You know, I tend to think that people who make that sort of argument, they're going to be very wishy-washy, right?
Yeah, so you're gonna do some sort of counting game, right? Well, look, the number of the good one. Yeah, not a
Right.
good approach, right? Yeah.
So going back to the well of classical theism, then the goodness of God is not grounded in our experience of the world as much as it's grounded in a metaphysic in which being and goodness are convertible, right? So, um, in other words, once we have the metaphysical framework to understand evil as a privation and being as good, we can use the apparatus of metaphysical deduction to conclude, say, through the fourth way of Thomas Aquinas or the fifth way, that there's an intelligence who's ordered the world, and that the gradations that we actually see, which include the privations, lead to a kind of maximally good being.
Yeah. So the point is in traditional metaphysics, it was really well stated, Daniel, is that um, the metaphysician is getting to God through a sort of series of necessary conditions, right? They're not, doing a lot of what goes on in, I guess, contemporary philosophy of religion. And fair enough. I think if you take the considerations of our article seriously, which I think you should, I think it probably would rattle or undermine a number of contemporary arguments in natural theology, right? In a kind of similar way that skeptical theism does, right? Like skeptical theism seems to have this issue too, but I think even skeptical theists would admit, okay, even if this is an issue for arguments like fine tuning or something like that, it certainly wouldn't touch those traditional metaphysical demonstrations if you think those sorts of arguments are successful. Um, so yeah, I think for the traditional metaphysician, there's no incompatibility here with natural theology. I think they'd actually be quite pleased with the result because you have an approach to God that not only establishes God's existence but the classical divine attributes, and then you have a clear, I think, very powerful response to the logical problem of evil. Um, but I'll but to the moral collapse issue, right? This is related but a little bit different, and this again is something that you've seen kind of come up from skeptical theism for people who are familiar with that approach, where the question is, well, does this sort of put us into a fog of skepticism concerning, morality and moral obligations and stuff like that? Or can we have any moral expectations at all? And there's kind of two different levels of this. One is concerning us and our affairs, and the other is concerning God and what we should expect of God. I think the first concern with us and our affairs is easily dispatched, right? Because nothing that we've said applies to how classical theists think about like natural law morality, right? We're quite familiar with human nature and the sorts of things that follow from our nature and what is good and bad and expected of us. So nothing that we said would interfere at all with our practical moral reasoning or moral affairs. The more interesting question is, does it put us in a fog concerning what we could expect from God, morally speaking? Like, can we have any sort of broad moral expectations with respect to God? And in our paper, we sort of leave that question open. We don't pursue it too much. We certainly both have thoughts, but mostly we
This
were
is
just concerned with showing that it's not a problem for the morality that factors into our everyday lives. But what sort of expectations or predictions could we, if any, still make about God concerning how he would, not just the type of world he would create, but how he would govern the world, is something we leave as sort of an area for open investigation of how one might begin to think about that.
so yeah, I think the metaphysical arguments that I'm pointing to, like, I'm a big proponent of the ontological argument, but also Thomistic cosmological arguments, um, I think can get you some moral properties without using some sort of empirical data. And as I said, maybe I was a little too quick to say we can give up on the empirical data. What I would say is rather, with the metaphysics in place and with revelation, which is a point that we've sort of discussed, Pat, that the faith being revealed to us of who God is, you can then look at the world. You can look at the sunsets and you can look at the evil and depravity in the world, and you can say, I understand that God is good.
Yeah, because the theory is determining the data at that point, right?
Right.
And that's not always pernicious, right? Sometimes it is. I actually just had a Substack about this. But to emphasize what Dan was saying, like, right, if you have a metaphysical demonstration for God, and you think that there's good reasons to think that God has revealed something about himself as well, and that because, God is truth and wouldn't lie, then you have good grounds for taking that revelation seriously, including about various moral properties that you think actually are revealed. How specific, that what sorts of predictions that'll give you about the world, I think are super broad at most. So I don't know if it's gonna like help make a whole bunch of like super precise, empirical predictions. I don't think it will at all. But I do think with Daniel that with these resources, you absolutely can have good grounds for inferring moral properties of God, consistent with the sorts of things we say in our article, the rule of
Right.
restricted inferences and all that, right? Mm-hmm.
So it kind of is a symmetry breaker for us if someone wanted to say, well, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If you can't say God is evil, then you can't say God is good, or you can't say God is imperfect, then you can't say God is perfect. We're not really approaching the questions the same way. One is okay, give me your best shot for why you're saying God would be imperfect in this view. And the other is, okay, we have all these arguments that are traditionally defended. Those are sort of separate, they're independent of the arguments and the bridging principles we're talking about. So if the atheist wants to attack those, they're going to have to go after those separately.
And Pat, I wanted to ask you, since you mentioned this in our like little group chat, that you wanted to get across that the argument's not an argument from analogy. Like the
Yeah.
Tolkien example kind of helps, I think, show an instance of deep metaphysical dependence or something like it. But just walk us through, just how to properly understand the Tolkien example.
Yeah, it's part of an inductive case. That's
Yeah.
it, right? So there's not a whole lot more to say about it. Like we're not claiming that we're God's fictional characters. In fact, we cite somebody who does sort of make a proposal like that, and we say this is not what we're up to. we're looking at this rule of restricted inferences and realizing that we've got to look at certain cases where there's this deep metaphysical relationship at play. And it just so happens that the Tolkien example is one of those, where he's
Mm.
actively imagining. It's not like on print or paper, right? And that's it. So it's just a like, yeah, just understand it's not an argument by analogy or anything like that. We're just looking at certain
Mhm.
cases where metaphysical dependence is in play, and it's clear that these inferences don't go right.
And to that end, we might even bring up the wholesomeness objection that we developed as well. So the whole point of the Tolkien thought is to kind of address this vertical and to say, well, actually, in the examples we have, it's really hard to make that inference. And so then when you say, well, we're not fictions, we kind of say, well, right. So you're going to have to change the principle, tighten it up even more, and that's where it becomes question begging. So we're kind of, you know, that's sort of the point. We're not arguing we're a fiction, but someone might back up and say, hey, actually, in that second formulation where you're just going on some sort of causal dependence, you can say that Tolkien, or at least some authors, are bad, right? The sort of extreme example that we came up with was the Marquis de Sade, who wrote many fictional works that show a depraved mind, right? That's where sadism comes from, and he has plenty of works that entertain rape and torture and all sorts of horrific murders and things like that, right? Um, so can't we read Desaad or maybe something else that's if you're going to go with Tolkien, maybe we'll talk about George R. R. Martin, who wrote a kind of morally ambiguous world. Maybe he's a little bit less moral than Tolkien was. And there, what we wanted to explain was you're kind of collapsing back into that horizontal level, because now you're talking about the reader's assessment of the author as it pertains to that sort of causal dependence, the causal dependence of what the author does to the reader, if that makes sense. So you read Martin, say, and the scenes and descriptions evoke lust in you, or bloodlust, or something like that. Or you read Desaad and you have those sort of pornographic scenes in your mind, and you say, "Oh, this is a bad person. They cause bad thoughts in my head." Well, that really has to do with how the author attends to the world they've created to the reader to evoke those feelings and imaginings. Does that make sense, Swan?
Yeah, and then I think what you go on to say is like that's not how God is operating, He's not intending these things to evoke within some reader or some spectator these experiences or desires or so on and so forth. So it's an apples and oranges case again.
Right.
Mhm.
Right.
I wanted to
Uh,
ask you one last question if you don't mind. And I know I'm kind of going off
Yeah,
the script a little bit.
I'm not going to add
Oh,
anything to that right now, but we have a whole section on that
right.
objection in the paper for people who want to get into the finer details of it. But I think that's right. There's certain conditions at play there that are obviously not applicable to how God and the world relate, including a sort of effectual attendance to
Yeah.
creation and stuff like that. But yeah. Sorry, back to you, Swan. Yep.
Yeah, it seems like the only way to save the logical problem of evil, if you're going to use it against a classical theist, is to somehow start with God, our commitments about God, and then articulate some theory of divine ethics, if you will, on classical theism that somehow show a contradiction. And I mean, I feel like that's the only way. But I was just wondering, if somebody goes down this road of God has more obligations, there are certainly some classical theists who have argued for such a position. How would your case here deal with objections like that?
Yeah, I guess we'd have to see the specific account, but I guess my initial thought is again, this is like if somebody articulates a theory of divine ethics, well, classical theists have sort of already thought about these things, right? And something that sort of comes to mind again is because there's an ethical and meta-ethical system already within the classical theistic worldview, right? It's a
Mm,
sort of
mm,
natural law ethical system, and this relates to what I said about avoiding moral skepticism, right? Like, what is What is morality? What is virtue? Well, these are things that are morality is a rational enterprise that relates to beings that can contingently self-determine, right? They can use their powers of intellect and will to consider the space of reasons and their will to close down around certain considerations and make efficacious any finite motive for action that is not inherently determinative, right? And we fail morally when we fail to consider some principle, some rule that we habitually know, right? That we could have considered, right? When it's not that we're ignorant, we can ignore things, right? And ultimately, right? Our sort of our ethical system in natural law is based around certain ends, the things that perfect us as the kinds of beings that we are. And once you understand morality within that enterprise, you start to see why something like Father Brian Davis's case is actually quite forceful. Because when you think about God, those conditions don't really apply, right? God is a being of pure actuality. He doesn't have any intrinsic passive potency. He doesn't have any further ends to attain, right? He's not on the path of development of contingent self-determination where he could choose poorly and fail along certain lines and fail to reach that perfect end state. He already is his own end, and he is the end of everything else ultimately, particularly human beings. So once you understand what morality is for the classical theist, a theory of natural law and privation theory or integrative unity and all that sort of stuff, this is why Father Brian Davis says, and I think generally correctly, that God is not a moral agent. And that sort of like freaks people out because they think that does this mean that he's evil? No, it just means that once you understand the internal commitments of classical theism, you'll see that there's just certain things that it doesn't make sense to talk about God in that way, and that these ideas of obligations and so forth, they're not relevant categories to the divine. Now, I think what you can say, and I think this is where I might break from Father Brian Davis a little bit, and Aquinas does say this, is God has obligations to himself, right? So Aquinas certainly thinks that if God sets out to create the world, he's not going to just randomly annihilate it 5 minutes from now and stuff like that. So it is interesting, I think, to see that Aquinas thinks that there are paths to having very broad expectations of God, right? Very, very broad. But they're so broad that they're not going to give you this sort of, God's going to help you when you get this terrible disease or something like that. It's nothing that's going to give you any sorts of predictions along those lines. And yeah, so sorry, I'm kind of rambling, but the point is that there's already an ethical system here at play that I think that one has to sort of abide by. But go ahead, Daniel. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
No, that we'd have to avoid, if we're gonna do an internal critique of classical theism. I think Pat and I would both push back on the idea that there's an external constraint on God as an obligation, right? That there's sort of an external moral theory that's imposed itself on God, and God's trying to conform to it and live up to it. But there is that sense of the inner essence of God, who God is. God is love, as revealed by John. But then how do we cash that out? That's where, again, I think the atheologian's going to have to shoulder an enormous burden. That's why we say it's epistemically inaccessible to say that the inner essence of God is such that God is, even in his omnipotence, is incapable of creating a world such as this. And so that means that an omnipotent being couldn't do what we actually observe, which is this world. This world is impossible for a perfect being to create, is kind of the claim. And so how do we know that's true? I'm not sure. I don't think that can be proved without begging the question. And that's sort of where we leave it. That's why we say it's unresurrectable. It is dead as a door. That's a mouthful, but
Well, gentlemen, I appreciate the conversation that we had today. And it was a delight to read the paper. I'm very happy that we were able to have this conversation and for me to give some intelligent kind of, I hope, back and forth. Just to give a spoiler to the audience, we did this before and I felt like I wished I was a bit more prepared. So I really dug into the paper and I'm trying to, give the best content that I can and also give Pat and Daniel their due for a really great paper. And so you can find it on New Blackfriars in that journal. And before we close the episode, do you guys want to say anything really quick?
Well, I want to thank you, Swan. This has been a delight, and I do want to encourage people. Yeah, check out the paper. We scratched the surface here, but I think
Hmm.
the paper has a little bit, I think, maybe of tedious wind up that we sort of skipped over. When we're talking about what metaphysical dependence is and the rule of restricted inferences. But I think that stuff is important to spend a little bit of time with, a little bit more time to really understand what we're up to and get the force of the argument, since it is sort of a quite a different sort of project
Right.
that we're up to. Um, but yeah, so they can check that out, and always love talking with you, Swan and Daniel.
thank you, Swan. I want to thank both of you, Pat, for working with me and on so many different projects. I hope to continue to collaborate with you moving forward. And Swan, it's always a pleasure to be on your channel. I really appreciate it and hope we can collaborate in the future as well.
Oh, yeah. Well, I look forward to collaborating Daniel and Pat on future projects. And with that, I think we can end the episode.